Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Citron. JJ served as a 2019 Upstate Institute Fellow at the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and has been honored to continue her work with NAHOF as a Cabinet of Freedom member. She graduated summa cum laude from Colgate University in 2020 and is a first-year law student at the University of Virginia, where she is a Law and Public Service Fellow. I now invite Citron to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Neha, for having me yet again to present at the Black History Matters conference, virtual webinar, if you will. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm so honored to still be involved with the organization. For those who don't know, I was a fellow at NAHOF in 2019. I have remained involved with the organization ever since, so I'm really thankful that you all have me here to speak today. So I'm going to be presenting a very high level review of gerrymandering, redistricting, and voter suppression in 2022. There is a lot of ground to cover. And I'm in law school right now at UVA, and I'm actually in an election law class. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds because I'm 3 weeks in and there is still so much for me to unpack. So I'm just going to give a very high level review here for you all today. So what is gerrymandering and how does it happen? So every 10 years, states redraw their legislative and congressional district lines following the census. And because communities are constantly changing, redistricting is critical to our democracy to make sure that the way that lines are drawn and how we're electing and who we're electing is reflective of the way in which communities look today. So essentially what gerrymandering does is it allows politicians to choose their voters. And why is that? Because those who are in control of redrawing those lines, it's the state legislature. So those who are in power are those who are redrawing these lines. And the way that you draw the lines is that you want people to elect you, right? So the way in which those maps look are created to maximize your chance of getting elected. And it's really a big problem that legislatures are actually in control of those who are redrawing the lines. There are commissions in some states that are tasked with redrawing boundaries. I believe it's 4 states right now, and otherwise the legislature is in control of the map. And how does this happen? So legislative and congressional districts look very different state to state. And the way in which we understand gerrymandering is through this idea of cracking and packing. So what does cracking and packing even mean? Cracking would split the groups with similar characteristics, including voters of the same party affiliation across multiple districts. And with the voter strength divided, these groups are struggling to find a majority in any one district. So you're actually separating those of the same party to ensure that their voice is actually minimized. And that's what cracking entails. In contrast, packing is the exact opposite of that. You're cramming certain groups into these congressional districts to ensure that the parties mostly are condensed within those districts and they don't have power outside. So who you're electing, it's like you these very strong districts of that same party to ensure that they do have a stronghold within districts, and then they're also dispersed throughout other parties that they have a smaller voice. So you have cracking, where you're dispersing all of the voices, and packing as well, to make sure that they're all in one district, to make sure that their voice is represented in maybe one place and not elsewhere. And this is especially detrimental to communities of color. This is what we say in my election law class as vote dilution, where communities of color are actually, their voices are minimized in that their voices are not as strong in certain districts, and then otherwise in other districts you're packing them into specific legislative districts. So this is especially a problem for communities of color in the United States. And sort of just a bit about the scale of gerrymandering. You see this on both a statewide level and a congressional level. So here you have this little diagram about Wisconsin, where Scott Walker had lost with 49.4% of the two-party vote, but he still carried 63 assembly districts. So he actually won 63.6% of the 99 districts. But at the same time, he ended up losing. And then a congressional issue in North Carolina, and you can see in this picture, the way in which the districts are drawn, especially you see this orange district here in the bottom, is really bizarre, right? There's nothing really compact about this district. It's not really looking super contiguous either. So where you see here is this really clear example of cracking and packing, most likely, where specific parties are put into specific districts where maybe, let's say, one district is representative of all of the Democrats. And then throughout the rest of North Carolina, I mean, it's not actually just one district, but that's just an example. And then the Democrats might be spread out across the rest of the state, where relative to Republicans, they have a small voice. Just one example. And, I don't want to say that this is just a Democrat or Republican problem specifically. Republicans are the main beneficiary of gerrymandering and of drawing the districts. But Democrats have also benefited. So Maryland's 6th congressional district flipped from red to blue, and that was in 2011 because of the way that the lines were drawn. So in this case, in 2011, the districts were drawn in such a way that advantaged Democrats by ensuring that the Democrats had a larger voice. And that's literally just the way that the lines were drawn. So Republicans might have been more spread out and represented across other districts. And as a result, because they were more spread out and not condensed into one congressional district, their voice was silenced. So just a bit about race and gerrymandering and the importance of the intersectionality between the two. Political party is often used as a proxy for race. So obviously you're not going to say that I want to oppress Black voices, but as a result, the way in which these lines are drawn, as we know, Black people across the US are more likely than not to be in the Democratic Party. So the way in which we're drawing those lines, we're silencing Democratic voices, but at the same time, we're also silencing Black Democratic voters. So you see the way in which political lines are drawn in ways that you're disadvantaging Democrats, but you're also disadvantaging people of color, and specifically Black voters in the United States. And one case that I wanted to talk about specifically was Rucho versus Common Cause. This occurred in 2019, and it is a really important case because it essentially gives the green light for racially discriminatory maps, and under this guise of, well, we're actually separating it by party lines. So the one big rule that came out of this case was that judicial review, and that, going to the Supreme Court regarding gerrymandering doesn't meet the requirement of judicial review. So basically saying, I can't hear this case in court. The court ruled that partisan gerrymandering claims presented a political question that reached beyond the scope of federal courts. So essentially, the court is saying in this case that, this is a political question and this is not something that we can hear. So you're basically shutting the door for all future claims being brought that are related to the racially discriminatory nature of gerrymandering of these maps. So that's a big problem because you're basically foreclosing any sort of legal redress. And just about the history of gerrymandering, this did not just spring up from the middle of nowhere. Just a bit of history. In terms of Virginia's first congressional map, Patrick Henry had actually attempted to draw district boundaries in a way that would block his rival James Madison from winning a seat. So you see this very historically rooted gerrymandering, and that is replicated today in ways that perhaps are less obvious. So computer programming, algorithms, and statistics, and you're using these intricate data mechanisms and algorithms to allow maps to sort of game redistricting on a really large scale in a very precise manner. So now at this point, you're not just back in when you're drawing Virginia's first congressional map where you have to draw by hand. So now you can create and pick from all types of computer generated maps in ways that will advantage certain parties over others. So you sort of see this very historical background. I brought it up to show how far back it's gone to the present day, where map drawers, obviously in the legislature, are using these very sophisticated programs to draw maps in ways that you're seeing are not just along party lines, but it's also racially discriminatory as well. And this is just a case study. I wanted to talk about North Carolina specifically. It is one of the most gerrymandered states in the US. And I'm going to start here on the far left. So you see 2010, and I actually showed this map earlier, but you see the way in which these district maps are drawn in ways that are not compact at all. And that is because of this cracking and packing that I was talking about earlier. You want to both condense specific parties in a way in which you know that it's going to go either red or blue, to keep incumbents in power, obviously. And then at the same time, you want to disperse minority voters in ways in which that they're not going to have a stronghold to overthrow an incumbent. So you see that sort of cracking and packing where you're condensing and then also spreading out voices. So moving on to 2019, you see a bit of this crazy orange has sort of gone away. So that's good. But then you also see, and, it's not perfect because certain districts are still drawn over here in this sort of odd way, and especially right here. And that's to keep political parties together. And flash forward to 2021, you're seeing obviously this continuation and this odd sort of shape, and then District 9, really small. And it's interesting because the numbers of these districts are also changing, right? Obviously, you can't see it totally because there aren't numbers for both maps, but once the 11th congressional district, and now you're seeing it as the 14th congressional district. So that's just an interesting note. And you see right here, the 7th congressional district is obviously in the southernmost part of the state. And then you see the 7th congressional district here shifting. So I just thought that was interesting to note. So I want to do a quick overview about current legislative remedies. Starting out, For the People Act, overall just at a really high level because these acts are very, very long. And obviously I can't go into every single piece of it, but the bill would enhance transparency, strengthen protections for communities of color, and ban partisan gerrymandering in the congressional redistricting cycle. Or congressional redistricting process, excuse me. It would also improve voters' ability to challenge gerrymandered maps in court. And we just saw Rousseau versus Common Cause that essentially the court said, no, we're not going to deal with this. So the For the People Act would change that result. The For the People Act passed in the House and, still pending in the Senate would make it easier for Americans to register to vote and cast a ballot. Like I said, outlaw partisan gerrymandering, as well as, in making it easier for folks to register to vote and cast a ballot is really strengthening and improving the vote by mail process, which we saw in recent elections, especially in the pandemic, is that vote by mail was really, really important to ensure people who couldn't make it out to the polls could register to vote and then cast that vote by mail. And then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which has passed in the House and still has not passed in the Senate, has essentially tried to restore various voting rights that have been sort of gradually ripped away from various Supreme Court holdings. So just one example is that Shelby County versus Holder in 2019, the Supreme Court had struck down one of the Voting Rights Act most powerful tools, which was regarding federal government oversight that had ensured that states did not pass discriminatory laws and discriminatory practices. So this court case essentially allowed these jurisdictions to make their own voting requirements and voting processes without any sort of federal government oversight. So what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would do is sort of restore that federal government oversight to avoid any potential abuse. The Freedom to Vote Act would essentially standardize voting election laws across the country. So to sort of maintain that consistency across states so that various states don't have different sorts of obligations, as well as reverse the effects of other state level voting restrictions that had passed in the following or this previous year. So that could be, restrictions on mail-in voting or certain restrictions on when you can register to vote that various states have imposed. So it would sort of work to turn back the clock and overrule those very specific state level voting restrictions. So for example, the bill would make Election Day a federal holiday and allow online, automatic, and same-day voter registration, a no excuse mail-in voting with ample access to various ballot drop boxes and ensuring an online ballot tracking system, a whole wide range of increasing access to the ballot, which is really important. So states would also need to accept a wide range of forms of ID, non-photographic identification in certain places where ID is required to vote. Other examples of expanding ballot access would be restoring voting rights to formerly incarcerated people who were convicted of felonies, more protections and resources to folks who have disabilities and who need more attention and care and assistance in getting to the polls or mail-in ballots and mail-in voting, as well as overall just greater federal protections and oversight for voting in U.S. territories as well. So you see this really broad range and expansion and ensuring protections to folks to ensure that they can vote. So unfortunately, these legislative remedies have not made it through the Senate, and that is because of the 60 vote filibuster. And that's a whole other kettle of fish that I wish I could get into explaining the filibuster. But it is essentially where the Senate requires a supermajority of 60 votes to pass this legislation. And it's the legislation here that's been proposed is not getting those 60 votes. So it can't make it over the filibuster. So unfortunately, you have these really incredible measures that have passed through the House and that are sort of stuck in this purgatory in the Senate. This is hopefully not forever, but it is the current situation. But at the same time, I wanted to highlight the really important community work and various organizing that specific groups have mobilized to increase education about voting rights and about what this legislation is going to do and fight fears about potential mail-in ballot fraud. There was a really big, unfortunate smear campaign about mail-in ballots, that the process is fraudulent and that ballot boxes are being stuffed with fake ballots, and that's just not the case. So these local organizations are at both state and community levels. So I wanted to highlight a few. National nonprofits, Common Cause, the Brennan Center for Justice, the American Civil Liberties Union, Fair Vote, all on the line and indivisible. And these groups are doing really important work, as well as local organizations at state and community levels all across the US and beyond. So thank you so much for learning a bit about what gerrymandering is and current legislative initiatives to combat gerrymandering. And thank you so much to NAHOF for organizing an incredible month of Black History Matters educational pieces. So thank you so much.
Thank you, JJ, for your contribution of this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, NAHOF has provided a reference list of sources to learn more about it in the video description box. Additionally, please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Please do contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, thank you, JJ, for donating your time and contributing to this program. And thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey, Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.